At the end of last year, I was very excited about the Douglas Adams audiobook that was successfully launched on Kickstarter. Previously, it was titled Douglas Adams Explained the World, but it's since been renamed to Douglas Adams The Ends of the Earth. The backers got sent the final version of the audio about 2 weeks before the book's general release on the 24th of June, and there are a lot of high profile interviewees involved, such as Stephen Fry and Sanjeev Bhaskar, friends and colleagues of Douglas's like Robbie Stamp and Ian Charles Stewart, experts in scientific fields that Douglas was passionate about, like Mark Carwadine, Professor Brian Klass, and Lucy Cook, a fantastic actor in Sam Barnett reading and performing extracts of Douglas's work, and the cherry on the cake is that they had access to Douglas's archive at St John's College in Cambridge, which contained never-before-heard audio files, Douglas's personal letters, and videos of his lectures. In short, they had a goldmine at their disposal, and all with the permission of Douglas's estate and family. Ends of the Earth was written, narrated, and directed by Arvind and David. I've been very fortunate to have a level of access to him that I don't think most people do, and I've been a pretty big fan of his for nearly a decade now. I don't enjoy criticising Arvind. I have a lot of respect for him for what he's done for the Adamsverse and for Dirk Gently in particular over the years, but I have to be honest and speak out, and if that risks me losing my access to him, then so be it. I've listened to the book in full over the past week, and I really wish that I could give Ends of the Earth my wholehearted recommendation, because it had so much going for it, as I say. But sadly, I can't. And the reason it's so frustrating for me is down to one interviewee whose inclusion I find overshadows the entire project in a pretty distasteful way, and that's Max Landis. For those of you who don't know, Landis was hired by Arvind to be the lead writer of the 2016 Dirk Gently adaptation on BBC America and Netflix, and the two worked closely together for several years until the show was cancelled and it emerged that Landis had a lengthy history of abuse towards women that he had been concealing from the public. There were numerous allegations, including from those in the cast and crew of Dirk Gently, ranging from sexual harassment and abusive behaviour to, in one case, rape. Arvind himself put out a post condemning Landis' behaviour at the time. The fact that he's featured here very much suggests that Arvind has since reconciled with him. All of this might come as a shock to people who listen to the audiobook because none of the allegations are mentioned at any point, and Landis is introduced by Arvind simply as a screenwriter who's occasionally a little controversial. At the time I'm making this, there have been no prosecutions brought forward against Landis as a result of these allegations. However, Landis himself has stated that some of the things he was accused of in those testimonies are true, but he's only admitted to the least bad accusations, and he's never been very specific about which ones those are. I think it's misleading to talk about Landis' work on the Dirk Gently BBC American Netflix show and to not acknowledge that his behaviour on set was, in no small part, responsible for the show's cancellation. Now let me be clear, I'm not saying that everybody should throw their Blu-rays in the bin and campaign for it to be taken down from all streaming services. I'm actually one of the people who, for my sins, enjoys the series for what it is. But what I am saying is that the show was not made in a vacuum. Max Landis used his position as showrunner to abuse the people who worked underneath him, not just physically but also emotionally and psychologically. And my concern is that if we forgive and forget and act like it never happened in the first place, then he will do it again. Now you might say, hang on, surely an official audiobook about Douglas Adams is not the right place to hash out Me Too allegations against a Hollywood screenwriter. Shouldn't the focus be on Douglas? I completely concur. And to that I offer a very simple solution. Don't interview a credibly alleged sexual predator. He never met Douglas, he's not a scientist or a politics professor or a theologian. He is literally the son of a himself controversial Hollywood director that got to write Douglas Adams fan fiction for TV. Far from missing an essential viewpoint, the book would have been significantly improved had he been left out of it. There was a strong rumour early on in the project that Neil Gaiman was at one point going to be interviewed for this, and then the allegations came to light about his own abusive and disturbing behaviour, and he was quietly dropped from the project. Gaiman is currently going for a civil lawsuit, so they dodged the bullet there. But then Arvind decided to load a Max Landis-shaped bullet into his revolver instead, and shoot himself in the foot. If I'd known going in that Landis was going to be one of the interviews, or if his name was mentioned on the Kickstarter page anywhere when it launched, then to be very honest, I would not have backed it. But since I did, I want to give my thoughts on the audiobook as a whole. What becomes quickly apparent is that Ends of the Earth is not a biography of Douglas's life, but rather an attempt to dissect Douglas's thoughts and ideas and how they can be applied towards solving real-world problems. As such, Arvind could pick and choose virtually anybody he wanted to be interviewed for it. There are some like Lenny Henry that were interviewed and promised at the start of the project and didn't end up making the cut, and others like John Lloyd, a key collaborator of Douglas's, who worked with him on several projects like Hitchhiker's Guide and The Meaning of Life, who weren't interviewed at all. And I kind of get the impression that the celebrity interviewees who are close personal friends of Arvind, and not necessarily people who are closest to Douglas, are the ones that get the most play. I also think it's a shame that, other than one aside with planetary scientist Helen Maynard Casely, the female contributors don't get a lot of focus. Douglas's secretary for the final decade of his life, Sophie Astin, who's very private and very rarely gives interviews, recorded a 30-minute call with Arvind, and she gets one contribution to the final book in which she speaks for less than 27 seconds. As a matter of fact, Max Landis is in 9 minutes and 7 seconds of this book. All the female contributors added together totals in at just over 10 minutes, 8 of which are Maynard Casely. To put this another way, Max Landis gets to talk about Douglas for nearly as long as all the women in this audiobook put together. I don't think that was something that Arvind was consciously thinking about when editing it, but the optics it gives are a bit questionable, to put it mildly. Another consequence of this approach is that there is a lot of editorializing from Arvind. It's a book as much about Arvind's opinion on the world as it is Douglas's. And where that starts to become a problem are the moments where Arvind begins grandstanding on his soapbox and lamenting the actions of certain billionaires and presidents, and it veers dangerously close to being a indulgent polemic at the expense of Douglas's own voice. It's not even that I particularly disagree with most of what Arvind says about the current moment and what he hates about American politics, but I think the strength of Douglas's work and why it connects with so many people even years later is that Douglas wasn't preachy or preoccupied with calling out any one figure in particular. He was much more interested in picking apart the systems that result in such people rising to power. There's some criticism of the Ronald Reagan administration in Dirk Gently and in the short story Young Zaphod Plays It Safe, but that's about as specific as Douglas tended to go. Arvind's general despair at the state of the world is perhaps eclipsed only by my own despair towards Arvind. On the other hand, I think there's some well-chosen extracts from Douglas's oeuvre that Arvind then attempts to explain or recontextualize in interesting ways that feel accessible to the listener. Speaking of which, let's talk about those extracts and cutaways. So whenever Arvind references passages from Douglas's novels and writing, it's usually followed or preceded by a reenactment of said scene. As you would expect, Sam Barnett really gets to shine in a lot of these segments. Sam voicing the guide is a really inspired call, actually, since he's a fantastic narrator, and in the Dirk Gently segments, he voices Book Dirk as effectively his version from the 2016 show, which feels like it shouldn't really work, because his personality and the way he's written in the show is quite different to how Douglas writes him, but Sam kind of ties both interpretations together and makes it feel seamless. He also does a really interesting performance in character as Douglas when reading some of his articles and essays, which really went the extra mile, and I felt like he did a great job channeling Douglas's tone and mannerisms. Alison Cavanis performs any of the female characters that pop up, like Trillian or Janice Pierce, and does a pretty solid job, I think. And then we also get Arvind, who, with all due respect, isn't quite at the same level as either of them in terms of acting, playing Ford Prefect and the least Zaphod-sounding Zaphod Beeblebrox you will ever hear. It gives the air of Arvind doing a kind of temp voice that somehow made it into the final product, and I feel like Arvind should have just stuck to the narration, which he's frankly a lot better at. So all in all, there are 9 chapters, an appendix, and 6 short asides that Arvind couldn't seem to fit naturally anywhere in the actual chapters themselves, but were deemed either funny, moving, or interesting enough to be featured. I'm going to go through my thoughts on the first 8 chapters here, because they are the real meat of the content, if you like. And I'll do an episode of the Electric Monks podcast covering the whole thing in a bit more detail with my friend Nemo once he's done listening to the whole thing. It's about 6.5 hours in total, so definitely not the sort of thing you're supposed to listen to in just one go. Chapter 1 is about Douglas as a science fiction writer and a comedy writer, and it starts out with a load of interviews in which Douglas disparages science fiction, and Arvind then tries to pick apart and deconstruct these. I really like the interview with James Goss about Douglas's work on and deep love for Doctor Who. Arvind also feels the need to preface James's interview with a primer to explain what Doctor Who is, which I assume is there for the benefit of an American audience, especially when Arvind describes the cultural impact of Doctor Who in the UK being as if Star Trek and Saturday Night Live were the same programme. We also get Stephen Fry talking about P.G. Woodhouse's influence on Douglas, as well as a nice anecdote from Griff Rhys-Jones of a drunk Douglas constantly trying to rewrite a story in the back of a taxicab as he was telling it in order to improve it. Arvind's thesis is that Douglas doesn't fit neatly into either category as just a sci-fi or comedy genre writer, but he was simply an all-round genius and an obsessive-compulsive who struggled to meet deadlines as they whooshed by. So chapter 1, all in all, is a pretty good start, and I think the first question is set up and explored pretty well here. Chapter 2 is titled Explaining the World and covers Douglas as a public intellectual, and his need to fully understand concepts so that he could explain them. I think Richard Harris, the CTO of Douglas's company, The Digital Village, sums it up best when he says that Douglas had the unique ability to make the inexplicable obvious and the obvious inexplicable. Another highlight in this chapter is a never-before-published talk Douglas gives to a group of biotechnologists and drug company executives, where he explains how the computer has helped us to make better sense of our own complex world and how life really works. We also get Sam performing a few segments from the Dirk Gently novels early in this chapter, and one small detail that I love is the knockoff, copyright-free version of the Christabel Tapia de Vere Dirk Gently theme that prefaces any Dirk segments throughout the audiobook. It's different enough that it works as a unique motif for the Dirk novels, but it's similar enough that fans of the show will recognise instantly what it's trying to ape. If Dirk Gently had been made in the mid-2000s and had a really cheap PS2 tie-in game where developers couldn't afford the rights to the actual theme tune, this is probably what they would have used instead. Chapter 3 is where the book transitions from trying to prove that Douglas is a genius to applying Douglas's unique brand of genius towards the pressing issues of both his lifetime and of today. The first subject is technology and the internet. The first 40 minutes or so covers Douglas's fascination with Apple, him setting up the Digital Village and his attempt to build the Hitchhiker's Guide in real life. And there's also a really great article by Douglas in this section on online trust and misinformation, which, as you'd expect, has aged incredibly well. There's also a lot of discussions of what Stephen Fry calls the enshittification of social media. Ian Charles Stewart, the co-founder of Wired magazine, is the only one that pushes back a little bit against bashing it and using it as an excuse for everything. And as someone who's met a lot of Douglas fans through social media, even used it to help land a few gigs, it was nice to hear someone who is willing to be a lot more nuanced, and I completely agree with him that social media is a microcosm of broader societal problems with corporations and governments. Just as it seems to be wrapping up and Douglas has been given the last word on his vision for H2G2, there is a literal record scratch, and we get an archive clip of Elon Musk introducing his AI, Grok. And this is where things start going off the rails a bit. The last 6.5 minutes of this chapter are Arvind describing how he can't give Douglas the last word because Musk has perverted Douglas's vision of a more egalitarian internet. James Goss describes how if Douglas were around today, he'd delight in blocking him on Twitter, and one of the designers on Starship Titanic, Emma Westerkoot, mentions how when Musk sent a Tesla Roadster up into space with the guide inside, you could hear Douglas shifting in his grave. There's a few reasons why this segment goes down like a lead balloon for me. Firstly, Arvind is essentially inviting people that he knows hate Musk as much as he does to put the boot in. And maybe that's cathartic for a lot of people, but it's not insightful. It's just people going, wow, isn't this guy awful? Isn't he awful? He sure is. And to be honest, even before this book comes out, some of it is starting to date a little bit, as Musk is in the middle of a very public falling out with Donald Trump. But there's also already a very comprehensive, incredibly well-researched 8-part BBC Radio documentary by Jill Lepore called X-Man, the Elon Musk origin story, which goes into a lot more detail about hitchhikers as an influence on Musk and how some of its messages and themes seem to go completely over his head. Arvind's effort is a bit tacked on and shallow by comparison. Secondly, and perhaps most bizarrely, the interviewee who gets the last word is the one man almost as bad as Musk. Surprise, surprise, it's Max Landis.
At this point, I just sort of wanted to kill myself.
I went subjectly to the actual clip of his answer, both for copyright reasons and because his voice is just really shrill and irritating. But I'll read out a transcription of it so you get a bit of context for how this chapter ends. Elon, what a fascinating evolution of a public figure. What an unself-conscious transformation into a villain. I think certain people are cushioned by both their neurological makeup, their parenting, and the $400 billion behind them from having to look at the world in a realistic way. Whoa, the pot is calling the kettle black here, people. Whatever next? I think Douglas appeals to people who want to think they know a little better, because Douglas writes like he knows a little better. He writes like he kind of gets it a little more than you do. What I think someone like Musk misses is that Hitchhiker's Guide, or one anyway, is fucking about Arthur. You're really locked in his experience in that book. It's about a normal guy who's a victim of systems and institutions, and if you're someone like Elon Musk who exists at the highest spectrum of human power, he can have anything he wants. I think you want to believe you deserve that position. You have to believe you know better. It's almost like in his head he turns Douglas Adams into Ayn Rand. The problem with Elon is that he's a Zaphod, but he thinks he's a Ford. You know when you meet a Ford, and it's not Elon. Elon is Zaphod. He would have another head. His kid is named X23. He would do whatever it took. And I believe if you showed Trump the machine that shows you your size in the universe, the you are here machine, he would have the same reaction as Zaphod. Ah, it zoomed in on me. You have to wonder why Arvind decided to end the chapter like this, when he puts so much emphasis on who gets the last word. He describes the image of Musk and Trump sitting in front of the total perspective vortex as perhaps the best way of giving Douglas the last word. Now, I know this might sound silly, but hear me out. Wouldn't the best way of giving Douglas the last word be to just give him the last word? You know, like you started doing before you pulled the rug out from under us and instead had an overprivileged Hollywood Nepo baby who has a history of abusing his power tell us how out of touch he thinks Elon Musk is. The whole thing feels so performative. But you know what? Landis' final point about Musk's Zaphod-like narcissism is absolutely correct. He's far from the first person to make that observation, but it's not inaccurate. I will take it a step further. I think Musk will absolutely love the fact that he gets so much attention in a Douglas Adams audiobook that has the official approval of Douglas's family and archive. And this is not the last time that Arvind brings him up in the book either. It feels like this entire segment was added so that a serial sexual assaulter can deliver a smug gotcha to a neo-Nazi about how he doesn't get Douglas Adams. In trying to be topical and controversial, Arvind has lost sight of Douglas's voice, and, to put it bluntly, I think it's because his priorities were in the wrong order here. I needed a break at this point, frankly, to wash the sour aftertaste of Chapter 3 out of my mouth. Thankfully, Chapter 4 pivots away from Musk to cover Douglas's interest in animal conservationism, which of course was the main focus of his book, Last Chance to See. And as much as endangered animals going extinct can be a depressing subject, I actually found Douglas's response to the problem quite inspiring, to go all in on trying to solve it, to the point that even when his company was in financial difficulties, he was still trying to find enough money to save the mountain-back gorilla and the rhinos. And it's also clear that meeting these animals that have very different ways of viewing the world to humans in turn forced Douglas to think differently, to try and treat their experience with a level of dignity and respect. And that came across really powerfully here. Chapter 5 brings us back into the arena of politics. This is where we're introduced to Professor Brian Klass, an associate professor in global politics at University College London. Brian is a very welcome addition, probably my favourite of the experts that Arvind brings in, actually. He's very good at breaking down the substance of Douglas's often memed quotes, such as, "Nobody capable of being made president should on any account be allowed to do the job," and the lizard scene in Mostly Harmless. And he talks about concepts like self-selection bias and sortition in a really accessible way. I think Klass keeps the discussions focused on systems and solutions, and Arvind decides to focus on that, rather than just putting the boot into Trump, for example. Arvind let the guest lead the conversation a lot more here, rather than fishing for a particular answer, and I think that's a far better way of structuring these chapters. Next up is Chapter 6, The Collapse of the Galactic Economy. This is another interesting discussion where Arvind brings in Professor Hadrim Chang, an economist and radical critic of neoliberalism. He cites the Shoe Event Horizon as an example of excessive competition, leading to a race to the bottom, and a demise of the Magrafians' planet-building economy in Hitchhikers as illustrative of wealth in the real world being so concentrated in the hands of a few that there is not enough demand and the rich end up spending less in proportional terms than the poor. Of course, Arvind can't resist the urge to bring up Musk again here, and his net worth of over $400 billion. Elon Musk is a Magrafian, he tells us. He gets to remake worlds, and the rest of us now live in a world of his making. Still, the focus here is on why and how Trump and Musk position themselves as anti-establishment populists, despite both being insanely rich billionaires, so there's at least a purpose that's served in bringing them up as an example. The 7th chapter is intriguingly titled Dirk Gently's Rules of Governance, and sees the return of Professor Brian Klass, who makes the case that the world is not governed by understandable, clear, and obvious connections, but by randomness and chaos. Arvind immediately draws a link between this and the way that Douglas writes Dirk Gently, and there's a great discussion that flows out of this about chaos theory and the butterfly effect. Klass then comes up with 3 Dirk Gently inspired, yet surprisingly simple rules that would allow us to better navigate the chaotic and unpredictable world in which we live. Number 1 is to build a world focused on resilience rather than optimization. Number 2 is to experiment through trial and error to navigate uncertainty. And number 3 is to recognize the limits of your understanding and admit what you do not know. Brian's analysis of how TV news pundits and experts are under pressure to have an instantly prepared answer to all the important questions within 90 seconds, which ends up rewarding hubristic overconfidence and leads to oversimplified and often inaccurate narratives emerging, is absolutely spot on. This chapter ends with another criticism of Musk and Trump, in particular the Department of Government Efficiency, DOG, and its attempts to feed entire government departments in the US into the wood chipper by threatening and bribing people to resign. In particular, Arvind is critical of the arbitrary and since reversed decision to fire a team that were working on measures to prevent any Ebola outbreaks, which Arvind compares to the Golgafrinchans being themselves wiped out by a planetary plague in Hitchhikers after sending away the B-Ark full of the telephone sanitizers that could have stopped it. And he mentions that last time Trump was president, millions of people died from a global plague, despite the best efforts of the federal government. Like in the previous chapter, this one felt mostly justified and relevant to bring up, and overall, I think these middle 4 chapters are definitely the high point of the book. And that brings us to Chapter 8, The Ultimate Questions, which is all about religion. Or at least the first half of it seemed to be about religion, before it transitions into being about what Douglas believed in once he abandoned Catholicism. I have to be honest, this chapter kind of loses me after a certain point. I've listened to it a couple of times now, and I'm still not 100% sure what the overall takeaways I'm supposed to get from it are. So we start off covering Douglas as a radical atheist as opposed to an agnostic, and we get an interview of American Atheist from Douglas read out by David Baddiel. Now, going in, I kind of assumed this was going to be the Baddiel chapter, in which him and his perspective as an Orthodox Jewish man turned atheist was going to be the main focus. So I was surprised to learn that he's really only interviewed for about 4.5 minutes here. I didn't expect to be as engaged as I was by the discussion he has about there being a motivation to believe in God, that we want it to be true because we don't want to die. I mean, by the end of this chapter, I kind of did want to die, but that's not Baddiel's fault. A large section in the middle of this chapter is devoted to a full cast adaptation of Douglas's often told parable of the sentient puddle, which you can tell Arvind is very proud of. And as much as I love the original story, I don't think the parable really works here when recontextualized as a calming, breathing exercise Hitchhiker's Guide entry. The way it's written doesn't feel like a guide entry at all, other than a couple of extra lines that Arvind has added at the end. And something about it struck me as more mean-spirited and cynical than Douglas's performance of the story at lectures. I think it's having Alison Cavanis confusedly panicking and crying as her sentient puddle evaporates in the heat, and as Sam Barnett's narrator mocks her for being solipsistic and so self-certain. There's a real horror to that, and the sound design of the puddle melting away and the score going really dark also adds to that whole atmosphere. I felt like I empathized with the puddle more than I was meant to, which was not Douglas's intention. The puddle is meant to be abstract. You have a bit more distance to it when it's just a story that Douglas is telling instead of having an actress embody it. I also think it loses something without the prelude of early man wondering who made this world that suits them so well and deciding it must be something that looks a bit like them, but obviously much, much bigger and necessarily invisible. What's also missing is Douglas's link to environmentalism, the warning that if we think the world is meant for us, we will continue to destroy it because we think we can do no harm. We get a kind of offhanded, convinced that we still got global warming under control line from Sam, which honestly feels like a poor substitute. It felt like something that was a very neat, very simple metaphorical tale by Douglas, which has been overproduced and turned into something that doesn't mesh together all that well with the original concept. And I find it kind of ironic how Arvind introduces this segment by talking about Douglas's empathy towards why people need religion, that he was never arrogant or condescending towards them. And then the way this story is told seems to suggest the exact opposite. It's around about this point, 20 minutes into the chapter, that things truly start to go off the rails a bit for me. Arvind, like Douglas, was a Catholic who lost his faith as a young man, and he asked the question of where Douglas found his worldview after losing his faith. And who do you think he puts this question to? Is it a philosopher? Is it someone that worked with Douglas or that knew him even just a little bit? No, don't be stupid. It's Max Landis again, of course. And he replies by telling Arvind of what it was that first attracted him to Douglas's novels, which funnily enough was not the question Arvind actually asked him to answer. Landis says the following: I think the reason he connects so much with the teen mind is because he's, and I say this in the least patronizing way possible, baby's first introduction to nihilism. It's a deeply cynical worldview, expressed warmly, gently, with humor. It never tries to show off. It's extremely accessible. The jokes it's going for might be extremely heady in a way that makes you feel smart when you get it. So because you have sequences where it's essentially Douglas talking to you and having fun with you, the great difficulty of adapting Douglas Adams is that you are having fun with him in the books and he's taking you away from the story. Getting those asides from the author, who seems to be having just as much fun writing the book as you are reading it, I think that really pulls you in. And I think J.K. Rowling, in a much clumsier way in her early work, hit the same buttons of, this is a big world that is dark and uncompromising, to a degree in the Adams books that is so cynical. The idea that the earth will be made and will be made again, and everything's meaningless. God's final message to his creation is, we apologize for the inconvenience. It's nihilism, which is something you find if you're finding it through My Chemical Romance or you're finding it through H.P. Lovecraft. I think a certain kind of good-natured type of kid wants to hear that nihilism is funny too, and wants to go on a crazy ride with an author who isn't trying to show off, and is just trying to show you the craziest fucking story you've ever heard. First off, I think J.K. Rowling hits the same buttons as Douglas Adams, is a sentence that no human being should say, so it's just as well that it's the one person in here devoid of any basic humanity who says it. Douglas certainly put a lot of absurdist humour into his work, but I find the idea that Hitchhiker's Guide is the sci-fi comedy equivalent of an edgy emo band to be laughable. Of all of Douglas's novels, the only one that you could maybe argue is overwhelmingly nihilistic and bleak is Mostly Harmless, which Douglas wrote during a pretty miserable and tough year in his life. The fact that Landis feels Douglas is essentially a cynical nihilist like him, and that he considers himself to have been that good-natured kid that Douglas was specifically writing for, to tell him to comfort him that it's okay to believe in nothing, in fact it's really funny, I think that's more revealing of Max Landis' worldview than it is Douglas Adams's. Arvind then transitions to a clip of astronomer Carl Sagan, in which he talks about the great demotions, and he argues that Douglas, as someone who wrote about evolutionary theory and the idea that humanity is not as uniquely special or intelligent as it believes itself to be, would have been a fan of his, since this resonates strongly with the opening of Hitchhikers. Arvind states that Douglas replaced God with curiosity, the idea that we should always seek out new perspectives and that it's arrogant to assume our viewpoint is the only one that matters. Arvind then finally talks to two people who did actually know Douglas. Robbie Stamp gives a very deeply thoughtful answer about how Douglas was a phenomenologist and a what-if thinker who always criticised the hubris of anybody who believes they're at the centre of the universe. Arvind then brings up the total perspective vortex and the humility that it brings as what he sees as Douglas's alternative to the arrogance of religion. Stephen Fry is then asked directly what he thinks Douglas replaced religion with and makes the case for logic. Arvind replies with, "Yeah, that feels right for Douglas." And this is meant to come across as a culmination where Arvind also invokes the quote he cited from Douglas in the first chapter: "Without logic, there is no surprise and there is no joy." But what it comes across more as is, right, we need to wrap this up now. Stephen Fry says it's logic. Let's go with that and end it. This was clearly a really personal subject to Arvind, but it's treated pretty abstractly. Some of the links feel more than a little tenuous, a bit of a stretch, and we end up with a load of wildly different answers and only a very vague, wishy-washy consensus that Douglas replaced religion with some combination of science, logic, curiosity, and nihilism. We then get our epilogue chapters, including the appendix, which features a lengthy monologue from Landis, which I can only describe as a victory lap for him, where he talks in detail about his creative process on the Dirk Gently show and how everybody else gets adapting Douglas Adams wrong. At one point, he claims that he built a tribute world to Douglas and compares it to how Star Wars was a tribute to Buck Rogers and Indiana Jones was a tribute to classic adventure serials. That's right, he's comparing himself to George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. And he also seems to kind of be implying that his show has supplanted Douglas's novels in pop culture in much the same way as well. The sheer arrogance and egomania of the man is quite frankly astonishing. Even after everything he did, all the women that came out against him, all the bad PR that created, the people who claimed he would never work in the industry again, ultimately, here he is, getting the last laugh. Max Landis won. The problem when someone you look up to does something that you find morally reprehensible is that it doesn't just reflect badly on them, it reflects badly on us as a fandom too. Because Arvind built up a lot of goodwill with the fans over the years, enough for us to spend over £138,000 to back this project. He decided to throw away that goodwill. Arvind decided, come hell or high water, that it was essential to the project that even under pressure to remove Landis, he would not budge. It makes me embarrassed and frankly ashamed to be a Douglas Adams fan, that I've been duped into paying my own money to platform an abuser. Even if there are other parts of the project that I liked, it's impossible for me to just pretend that Landis isn't a part of this. When your heroes let you down like this, rather than being critical, there's that temptation to take the easy route, to ignore it, or even just to downplay it. But that's not something I'm prepared to do. Where do we go from here? Well, Arvind does have a bunch of Adamsverse projects he is working on right now, including the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy stage show, which is scheduled to open in London this November. I believe tickets go on sale next week. And the animated Dirk Gently series, which is still in development hell after 6 years. Arvind also mentioned that he is hoping to produce a Hitchhiker's movie at some point in the future, which I'm pretty sure Disney still own the rights to, so that seems pretty ambitious at this point. But the bottom line is, we're going to get at least one or two more Adamsverse projects from him in the near future. And as far as I know, Landis is not involved in any of these. But then again, I thought the same for Ends of the Earth, and look what happened. So the question I'm left with is Arvind the right person to trust with Douglas Adams' legacy? And that's something I feel incredibly conflicted about. Even if these projects all come out and are amazing, and I believe they all could be, Arvind has tainted his legacy through this decision. Frankly, he's tainted Douglas's legacy too, which is even worse. Because now that Landis is in this project, post-allegations, that's not only a victory for him, it's also a victory for the very vocal online following that seem to think that Landis is actually the victim and believe whatever he says without question. What I fear and suspect is that we're going to get a lot more of Landis's fans coming out of the woodworks, not just asking, but demanding, why isn't there a season 3 of Dirk Gently being made and written by him? And I strongly feel that the whole season 3 campaign has been slowly turned over the years into this deeply toxic, backwards looking thing. Granted, there are a lot of people that stumble upon the show on a streaming service years later and don't know anything about Max Landis. But still, the information isn't exactly hard to find online. It's a subset of fans that have bought into this idea that we can just go back to 2017, which was 8 years ago now, and pretend that Landis didn't do anything wrong or just flat out ignore or downplay what he did for the sake of continuing a TV show that they loved. And it's incredibly sinister to say that actors who were abused should be forced to work with Landis again for the sake of entertainment. That's something that Landis fans have genuinely said to me, by the way. I've argued very passionately over the years that you can be a Dirk Gently fan without being a Max Landis fan, that you can enjoy the show as a piece of art, that you can enjoy Dirk Gently as a franchise, and you don't have to support him at all. But the whole separate the art from the artist thing starts to fall apart a little bit when you invite the artist back to talk about their work, and you elevate their opinion like this. And I worry that this audiobook that was supposed to unite the fandom is going to end up instead dividing it even further, and that just makes me feel really sad. It's been pointed out to me that one of the Max Landis' scripts, Deeper, is being made into a film by Tom Cruise and Doug Liman. This was a script that MGM optioned in 2016, I believe for 7-figure sum, and then they couldn't make it because the allegations came out. So my understanding is that Cruise and Lyman are likely to end up rewriting it substantially so that they can downplay Landis' involvement, which is basically what happened on another film based on a Landis script called Shadow in the Cloud, which came out within a year of the major allegations being made. But even so, Hollywood tends to be very, very eager, almost too eager, I would say, to forgive people like Landis, especially if they are well connected, if their dad directed Thriller and the Blues Brothers, and if they wrote a Douglas Adams TV adaptation that people liked. Ever since the allegations dropped, Landis has spent the last 5 or so years running his own holistic script consultancy. He absolutely trades on and thrives on the fact that people still associate him with Dirk Gently. And him using Douglas Adams to whitewash his own reputation is incredibly cynical, and sadly, it seems to work. I'm disappointed in Arvind, but ultimately it's not me that he has to answer to. It's the women who were abused by Landis, the women he claims to believe when the allegations dropped 6 years ago. Because if anybody's been betrayed here, it's them. And it's the female Douglas Adams fans who are going to see that Max Landis is in this, and they're going to want nothing to do with it. And you can't really blame them, because a fandom that accepts and tolerates Max Landis is a fundamentally unsafe place for women.